Well, welcome everybody. Thank you all very much indeed for coming to Wolfson College, and a very warm welcome. I'm Kate Kennedy. I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, and this is one of our many wonderful events this term. We are really thrilled to have Mike Wooldridge, the BBC World Affairs correspondent from, I believe, 1972 onwards, who has seen a thing or two, I think it's fair to say, and of course Philippa Smethurst here, who I know many of you know well. Some of you will be meeting her for the first time today, but she is no stranger to us at the Life Writing Centre. I first saw this as a Word document quite a few years ago now. It's changed enormously in some ways. In other ways, the core of its message has remained the same. Now, we as a centre support people writing their life story. We support very eminent writers on their 10th book. We support people who are putting pen to paper for the first time. And what we find is that everybody who comes to us has a story to tell. Some people might be more skilled already at telling it, others not so much, but everybody has something very interesting that has integrity and authenticity that they can communicate to others. And from that we learn and we grow. And this is absolutely true of this project. Philippa has 30 years experience as a great psychotherapist. And through that time, she has learned an enormous amount and benefited an enormous amount of people. And, you know, I'm genuinely in awe of the commitments and the struggles to go from having these ideas in your head to having this knowledge to actually getting it into this kind of a book shape, because it's not an easy journey. Some of us do it for a job, some of us do it to pay the mortgage, other of us do it because we can't live without writing. But Philippa didn't have to do this, and it's a big deal to write a book when it's not something that is your day job, and it's not something you do all the time. And she has done an extraordinary job, and that, I believe, is because she is driven by a desire to share this knowledge with people who will benefit from it. And I found, even proofreading it or editing it, that actually I'm seeing myself in some of these stories. I'm seeing pretty much everyone else I've ever met in most of these stories. There is a huge amount to learn from it. And the amount of people to whom I've said, gosh, you must read this, you will find this really useful. So I do hope that you will all feel the same and will enjoy being part of this very special evening, celebrating what Philippa has achieved, because it is no small achievement. Just to say a very tiny bit about the centre, we have free events all the way through Oxford term. We have probably 17 or so events a term, I think. We have a friend scheme that supports scholars in danger, that supports children with life writing, supports or teenagers with autism, all sorts of possibilities. If you would like to support what we do, we're entirely funded by our own efforts and enthusiasm, and reliant on people like yourselves. Do please talk to me, do join our friends group, our community, and come to our events. And if you feel you have a story to tell, or even if you're a very seasoned writer, we have a wonderful week in Tuscany coming up at the end of May, which is your brochure with the rather lovely pictures on your seats. There are a few spaces left. Do please talk to us if you think that you would enjoy being inspired and going on such a journey as Philippa's. And that's more than enough from me. Philippa will talk first and then be in conversation with Mike, and then hopefully we'll be able to open it up to the floor. I'm sure we will have a fantastic evening in store. So thank you, Philippa, thank you, Mike. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much indeed for that, and I apologise for my voice, by the way. What a day it is today. It began with the launch of this year's BBC Youth Lectures, as you might know, with the forensic psychiatrist and psychotherapist, Dr. Garen Ad's head, posing the question, is violence normal? Now, this evening here, another launch, the launch of Philippa Smethurst's book, 20 Ways to Break Free from Trauma. And we will indeed start now with the talk by Philippa, which will convince you, if you're not convinced already, that you should buy the book as well as coming to listen to it. And the book is called Why Trauma Matters.
Thank you very much, Mike. And thank you very much, Kate. And thank you for hosting this event properly. And thank you to Kate for excellent mentoring earlier in the process. And also to O'Leary for brilliant organising. And for people who come up from London and other far afield places, including Laura and Gracie, I think, from JKP. So I'm thrilled to see you here. I have a debt of gratitude actually to 43 people who read parts of the book, some more than others, and some of them are here as well. They know who they are. It's a privilege actually to stand here and share some of the things that I've been immersed in for a very long time. And the talk, as Mike has said, that I'm just going to put out to start with, is why trauma matters. So some really most important things to me about trauma. Trauma, being overwhelmed by life. Think of fabric. It's part of the warp and weft of life. It's every day, but it's also extraordinary in what it does to us. We may recognise, all of us, events or situations that have changed us from the inside. The subject of trauma has been one of endless fascination for me, and I've long pondered why. Maybe one reason is that trauma represents both the worst and the best of us. The worst is not difficult to see, the denigration of one person by another. When we dominate, turn away our gaze, become inured to others' suffering, dismiss, ignore, get fixated on one particular narrative to the detriment of anything else. We see the worst when folk are dispossessed, judged, treated harshly and heartlessly for reasons of prejudice or lack of proper care and loving attention. The worst is everywhere. War, disaster, hardship, deprivation. Things so often pile up and life really does throw curveballs. But so is the best. Evidence to show us that having gone through hardship and troubles, we might be inspired to observe how many work out what is most important and fight with determination. Maybe post-trauma, we can have more heart for the sufferings of others, find new devotion, work towards making a difference, reach out to connect, work for community and cohesiveness. Sometimes this transformation is not possible without a lot of work and help. Why does trauma matter? Trauma affects the whole of us. Everything that happens to us is connected to everything else, body and mind. A working definition, an overwhelming experience that undermines our ability to cope. Here is my friendly newly bought today, because the other one didn't work too well. Trauma shakes us up. Think of the Coke, the fizz comes, what's going to happen to that fizz? It has to go somewhere. And rather like the tentacles of the jellyfish, these responses from the fizz, if you like, if I'm changing metaphors, go to all kinds of places. My book has 20, of course, in real life, they're all mingled together. That's the subject of my book. Sometimes these responses are subtle, and sometimes they're really strange. Of course, it's important to say that bad things happen to people, and there's no lasting trauma. We get over it. But the point of trauma is, it's what's left behind, the fizz that's left behind. We are embodied. Trauma happens first to the body, that reacts. So when we're apprehended by too much to cope with, the whoosh of fear and shock and hormones and activation comes from the base of our spine, flooding the limbic region of our brain and disabling the prefrontal cortex higher functioning, affecting our ability to think, link, be strategic, logical, remember. Trauma is a response of the nervous system. Findings in neuroscience support this. We've heard of the term brain fog and seeing the world through plate glass. These experiences can be protective trauma responses. We can feel either too much, fight, flight, that we know about, activation in the red zone of the trauma thermometer, if you can see it there, or we can feel too little. We flop under the radar, we become dissociated. And those of us who are therapists, there'll be some online, will understand the window of tolerance, which was developed by Dan Siegel, but my colleague here, Sue Wright, has developed this trauma thermometer. When either we feel a buzzing activation in the red zone, too much, or the opposite. Of course, ideally, we all want to be in the green zone, feeling just right in our minds and bodies. Of course, we used to think it was all about the mind. Only 20 to 30 years ago in my profession, we used to think that if we told our trauma story, that would be enough to heal us from the overwhelm. But, problem, if we don't remember, that won't work. And also, retelling the trauma story triggered the trauma more. Of course, there's a place for telling stories, and finding words for our inner experience is very important, even if it comes out piecemeal. But we miss a trick if we don't include the body. We are embodied. Trauma is a body blow. Think of our language. The language is peppered with our stiff upper lips and our broken hearts. And we relive the battlegrounds of our past traumas in our posture, our hunched shoulders, and maybe places where we hold unresolved stress, like our grumbling guts or our clenched jaw. Our bodies carry the weight of our experience, and a good starting place can be to pay attention to our faithful bodies that have helped us survive. They can be our guides and tell us what's happened to us. And so often, if we respect the body and pay attention to its messages, it will tell us what we need and what we feel. Now we need to go to the words. First English, then Greek. So I happen to have, or we happen to have, a very lovely neighbour who's very good at anagrams, and Mike came up with this. The anagram for trauma, absolutely brilliant, because all of these responses that trap us, they keep us locked into the same thinking and responses. Trauma is a wound. This is the Greek word for wound. That's what's hidden inside. Sometimes, of course, life hurts us. Sometimes we recover. Sometimes we remain wounded. If you think about a physical wound, we see it, we tend to it, it hurts, we bandage it up, and we see it healing when a scab forms. But inner trauma wounds are invisible. So often, what we see is the trauma responses. And these trauma responses are protective of those wounds that are and trying to prevent more wounds from happening to us. That's the subject of my book, as well as what to do if we or someone we love gets caught up in a trauma response, gets dominated one, and doesn't know how to do anything different. One of the consequences of things being hidden is that they might be missed, and they might need some seeking out. Of course, some trauma responses are very much in your face. If you see somebody with a flight response, somebody who's cornered or confronted, they may lash out in red mist, or somebody who's caught up in a flight response. What they may have caught up in a behaviour that they seem to have absolutely no control over. They might evade, duck and dive, always changing their environment, their partner, always on a roll. Of course, an interesting thing is that hormones are involved in this one, and hormones can be addictive, and also brain circuitry changes addiction. Trauma skews our perception of ourselves and the world, and these beliefs that we hold need some unearthing. Trauma is very persuasive, and it also has its own logic. Have you ever met anybody who has a view of themselves that doesn't fit with reality? So a man who has lost his brother by suicide is ashamed of that. He's ashamed of that. And if he's ashamed of it, he can't grieve. He's locked in a trauma response. Another person who is so unwelcome in the world, profoundly unwelcome, that they have no self-worth at all. So they seek it externally, relentlessly, for the whole of their lives, never saying no to anything. We all know about fight, flight, but some other trauma responses are subtle and under the surface. Think of my jellyfish with the slim little tentacles getting everywhere. We might meet somebody who finds social contact really difficult, if not impossible, who pulls away rather than risking further hurt. We might meet someone who exudes a subtle but elusive aura of need. What we're picking up in that person, simmering under the surface, is maybe a deep cry from being displaced, ignored, rejected a long time ago, and some beliefs springing from that experience. There's a trauma story hidden under the surface. Go down the lift shaft, there's a trauma story so often. We might meet somebody else who seems friendly. Our new best friend wants to relate to us, but then with some slight goes dark, out of contact for weeks, ignoring our messages, then really surprised when we bring it up. Someone we're involved with whose trust in others has been broken. They might need others, but they can't help pushing us away with fear, digging up the foundations of the relationship. They will have had probably inconsistent care long ago. I always think of this, those of us who are old enough will remember Dr. Dolittle with the push me, pull you animal that pushes this way and that way at the same time. It's like that with a person who's been traumatized in this particular way. We say in our language, don't we? Are you all in one piece? But in trauma, we're not very often. We're fragmented. We have parts of ourselves that operate as if in compartments inside. The mind and body puts them there for safekeeping. But what might happen is that they might just pop out, like a jack in a box, out of control, raw, exaggerated. And crucially, it can be a facet of trauma that if you're dominated by one part, You might have no awareness of the other whatsoever. The most extreme example, of course, would be a dissociative disorder, what's called a dissociative disorder. We don't remember for good reasons. The technical word is dissociation. To survive bad things, we don't associate with a terrible thing. Our minds create a gulf between us and the experience. As Mike's colleague, war correspondent Lindsay Hilsum says, it's not what we remember, but what we forget in trauma. And sometimes it's necessary for us to forget and put parts of ourselves in compartments, as I say. We might not remember, but we might have little reminders. If trauma is an unresolved experience frozen in time, which is another definition, it makes sense that we might bump into it with a little reminder. This is called triggering. And triggering isn't just a memory, it can be a sensation or a somatic body feeling. It's a little, what I call a slither of pain. Triggering can be a horrible merry-go-round. There are people in the book like Joe, who survived an avalanche, whose PTSD got so exaggerated that for 20 years, his triggering got worse and worse. Can you imagine how, if you felt terrified every time a doorbell rings? I say to folk, it's rather like if you've got the bottle of water that's so full to the top, it's also flowing down the sides. How do you discharge the fizz, this charging trauma? What do? Do we discharge it, or do we come away from the activation? If you think about the trauma as being like a volcano with the center of the volcano, you have two choices. You can either come away from the center of the volcano, and many trauma therapists would go down that route. You just stay with the circular lines, which are your resources and your good things, and you don't go too near the center. Maybe you can do a bit of both, is my thinking. Why does trauma matter? Well, we're all doing our best, but some information and understanding goes a long way. Trauma traps us in the sense that it cuts us off. It breaks the threads to ourselves, and it breaks the threads to other people. We can't trust ourselves. There are many in this world, I believe, who are locked into their own holes of misery, unable to connect with good things, reactive, volatile, difficult to manage, and easily judged. Unrepresented and overlooked. They're often on the edge of society. They may have psychiatric diagnoses, complex lives with intersecting problems. They may be very vulnerable, fragmented, labeled, dismissed, and fall through the cracks of the need of the help that's there for them. They may deeply blame themselves or even hate themselves for their own difficulties. Trauma may well be at the heart of this, but isn't always recognised as such. Though there are signs of change, I believe, in this regard. In my work, I'm often inspired by the words in the opera by Benjamin Britten, Peter Grimes. If anybody's been to Aldborough Beach, there's a skull up there. I hear the words that will not be drowned. I hear the words that will not be drowned. And it's etched into the sculpture of the scallop. You can have a look at it later. How marvellous for trauma work. But it takes time to hear the sound of the sea if you put a seashell to your ear. This is not quick. Our minds can be mysteries to ourselves. If no one has taken the trouble to be with us and understand us and help us unravel and unpack these facets of trauma and make sense of them, we might well pull away from the world and struggle alone, feeling judged. And that traumatizes us too. Trauma upon trauma. Think about dominoes lined up. It's a double whammy. Being dominated by trauma responses destroys quality of life, and a bit of information makes all the difference. Think of a tangled ball of wool, whether you're a knitter or not. Can you imagine untangling a really tangled ball of wool? This is the painstaking bit of work that we do in psychotherapy, but I'm not saying everybody needs psychotherapy. There's lots you can do without that. With the information, you can separate out the strands. It's massively relieving. It's normalizing. So it's not just me. This is trauma. No big deal. At some point, trauma happens to us all. And this is how it's showing up with me. So I went to Heathrow and I saw a trauma kit. Can you see the poster there? Okay, so there's the trauma kit on the wall. I took its picture. I had to, didn't I? And this lovely lady I've met in Banbury developed this poster. So what you've got there is you've got the scalpel, the elastopass, the bandages, the needles, all the things that you could imagine that you might need in a trauma kit for the body. But what do we need for our psychological trauma kit? It might be a wide array of things, and not one size does not fit all. We need, as Nick Hitch says, that Mike's going to talk about, a buffet. We need a buffet. My book is it's been quite taxing to promote. Those of you who know me well know the social media has been somewhat trying, because the book is aimed at a general audience. So anyone with trauma, or with a loved one with trauma, or a therapist who's working with clients, or a student of therapy could read the book. It's full of things to do, stuff to do, to reclaim the inner experience and sew the threads back together. So it's full of exercises, questions for reflection, stories from real life, and hopefully ways to return to the body and the mind and take in the good, take in the good. There's lots, somebody pointed out, of reflection, rhythm, and repetition in the book. Maybe it's the music and me coming out. But I think that's quite interesting. It's also very much bite-sized chunks. There's no paragraph longer than that. The reason being, you don't need me to tell you, you get overwhelmed, right? You can't read too much if you're overwhelmed with trauma. So without patronizing folk, it's just a little. And also it's a trauma bookshelf. If you've only got the problem with fight, go to chapter 4. You get the idea. Then the glory is what happens next, post-traumatic growth. There's not enough talked about it, but the last chapter of the book is twice as long as any other chapter, and so it should be. Post-traumatic growth. What hope, beauty, goodness can spring out of chaos, disintegration, darkness, and how can we work towards that? When we face what has broken us, we can tie our threads back together through hard work. It can be a hard work miracle, like psychological daily weight training, but rather like a Japanese kintsugi vase. What is broken can also be made strong, like gold. I want to speak about this and celebrate it. I want to make the invisible visible. And all this springs from my 30-year experience of sitting with trauma, getting to know its ways, and my deep desire to share the findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just say before we start, there are some seats, you can probably see them down here in the front. Certainly 5 here, maybe there's a few others scattered around rather than having to stand at the back for the next hour. So I'll let you take those seats there. Now, Philippa sometimes writes short poems immediately after a session that she has, and then she offers them as a gift. So what we're going to do now, she's going to share just a few of those poems with you and there'll be illustration behind her.
Chapter 1, Trauma Takes Us Over. Frightened, jumping this way, that way, only knowing my fragmented, terrified, beyond twitchy self. Bump off edges, jarring, jangled, ricocheting, at the mercy of life, at the mercy of me. My pinball self, let me rest. I long for a kinder way. Chapter 6, Frozen Inside. Frozen cold, locked in, frozen in fear. If I tell them I'm a frightened child, cold moon in my chest. Hard to give words, even to this painful core. Yet, as I do, I thaw a little. Chapter 13, Broken Trust. I've been drowning for so long, not trusting you or anyone to be my lifeboat. Yet, so wanting you to know my experience. My thrashing about, not knowing what to do, is scary. Maybe help me? Such a relief and hopeful. Chapter 14, Hidden Cries. You won't hear me. You sit over there. You don't help me. No one can really help. But there's a cry from somewhere. I hope I'll be brave enough. Chapter 15, I'm to blame. Shame came around. I must hide away and be alone. This shoal of shame gets in everywhere. When all I need is compassion and touch. Chapter 18, lost my balance. I'm scared. I thrash about. This is how I live. Same old wheel. Round and round, faster and faster. How can I stop? Open a crack? Just trust. Chapter 20, post-traumatic growth. Trauma survivor, know your roots. You're allowed to be who you are in your roots. Painful though. Under the ground, our capacity is legion. Intricate, delicate threads connecting experiences, memories, feelings. Love rooting in its own time. It is in each other interweaving, like an entanglement of trees, that our freedom comes.
Thanks very much indeed, Philippa. And I think that the book is certainly much enriched by the poems. They're really excellent. I want to start the conversation by focusing just for a few minutes on a very powerful story about trauma, and which was told earlier this month on the BBC Radio 4 programme Life Changing, and it attracted a lot of attention. Some of you may have heard it, or sections from extracts from the story that were on the radio later. So I'm just going to summarise the story briefly to make sense of the conversation we can have about it. This was a man called Nick Hitch. Philippa mentioned him very briefly in the talk, and it's about the experiences he went through when he was taken hostage in Algeria. I'll just summarise the story. This was in 2013. He was the project manager on a gas plant refit in the eastern part of Algeria. He'd just gone to breakfast with colleagues at 5:30 a.m. on the 16th of January 2013, when an alarm siren went off. An armed militant ran between buildings close by and then fired over their heads. They dived back into their accommodation. They heard fighting outside then over the next hour or so between the militants, later discovered to be Al-Qaeda, and the security personnel who were protecting the plant. Then the terrorists kicked the door of their room and pushed them out at gunpoint to join what was becoming a growing number of hostages, they immediately realized. And it was about 40 hostages at this point. The government ordered them to phone their families and their employers. They wanted publicity for what they were doing. Then they took the phones away, though Nick Hitch very cleverly handed over a dud phone and kept his working one in his back pocket. He had a yellow cord put around his neck and body, which was attached to explosive. They were kept outside all night, and at 8:30 the next morning, the lead terrorists said they would start shooting the hostages at 10, 90 minutes later, and Nick would be shot first. He tried to pray. He said the Lord's Prayer over and over again. And he says now that when he hears it in church, it's a significant trigger for him and takes him back to the scene in an instant. Well, at 10 o'clock, nothing happened. But later, a convoy of land cruisers were brought up. The militants, who were obviously with the hostages, shot out the windows and then filled each vehicle with hostages and their own people, with militants, about 10 altogether in each vehicle. They put explosives, more explosives, in the vehicles, and they set off. And he immediately realized, as did the others, this was a suicide convoy. They came under fire from the army, first of all, Nick says, and then the vehicles drove towards a ridge so that they would deliberately roll over. And as that happened to Nick's vehicle, he was now hanging upside down there, and there was an enormous bang and flash, and he slipped in and out of consciousness. He was seriously, very seriously injured. But as the vehicle then caught fire, he managed somehow to crawl out of it through one of those broken windows, and he began to think perhaps this terrible event was survivable. Many people died. I think he said it was about 40 in the broadcast. But he was picked up by the army and medevaced back to Britain and to his wife and children. Now, Philippa, you heard that broadcast too, like me. Now, Nick said in the broadcast that he discovered after this that trauma is forever, as he put it, and also that the past sometimes feels very present. I thought it was an interesting comment. And he said that after a lot of treatment, he had the resources behind him to have a lot of treatment. It's not as compulsive now as it used to be, but when certain triggers happen, he can still get overwhelmed.
Yeah.
What would you say is the most important lesson from his story?
Okay. Well, I loved Nick's broadcast. I'm going to be meeting him next week at St Martin in the Fields, which is brilliant. I think that his story is so honest. What he talks about triggers as having a rogue video recorder in your head going off at random times. And that was very vivid. His metaphors, I do commend it to folk if you're interested in listening to it. So the trauma is forever. He fundamentally still finds the world a very scary place. So his life was completely changed. And this is incident trauma, very different from chronic trauma, which sometimes we call it big T and small t, as I do in the book. But this is incident trauma. So there's a novel by Margaret Forster called Over, where she loses her daughter. And it's punctuated by before, after, so clever in the literature, because it's just letting you know that the world is changed forever. The boulder has come into the pond and all of the water's come out. So he's completely changed. The world is very scary to him. He's only able to manage certain things in a day, and he has to prepare himself for everything and recover afterwards. But the other thing is that he comes across beautifully. I can't wait to meet him. He has such a fire to do the things he can do. So talking about post-traumatic growth, what we find often is people find a distilled point where they can make a difference in the world. And so for Nick, he's volunteering with Hostage International, which is the charity that Terry Waite started. And he wants to talk to other hostages, returned hostages, those who have been wrongly abducted, and family members. So that's an interesting thing, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yeah. I mean, in general, moving on from that particular story, perhaps, how do you find that people do live with being witnesses of horrible events?
Yeah.
Not only those who find themselves participants in them, but witnesses of them.
Yeah.
Or indeed who live with knowing that they were perhaps responsible for turning people away who were in great need.
Well, you mentioned, didn't you, Mike, a colleague of yours who was involved in the Ethiopian famine? I think that's right, isn't it? Who had that experience of turning people away. I think it's a great difficulty that if we not only experience a trauma, but experience a terrible event that we were not ourselves responsible for, we can feel responsible for. Think about the man who felt shame about his brother. It can feel, it's an involuntary thing. It's a thing that the mind does. I think it's a very difficult thing. So somebody in my book called Zach walked in on his brother, on his uncle abusing his younger brother, and carried that for years and years and years. And it took a long time to come to terms with the shame. We call it moral injury, and it's also things that soldiers feel when they have to shoot or witness others in warfare. I think a very important way through, and it takes a long time, is coming to a sense of compassion. And this Zach had a trauma therapist who said, you were a young boy. You were a young boy. You were not responsible. Have you ever thought that young boy is still inside of you? He hadn't. He thought of himself as a big, strong man and a weak man for not having helped his brother. But once he was able to see himself and compassionately connect, I'll show you my little doll over there in a minute, maybe. Once he could compassionately connect with that boy inside, it was a massive relief. And separate out the shame. That was the other thing he did. The shame was not his, it was the uncle's. And I remember him going around saying, not my shame, not my shame, not my shame. To almost extinguish it from his own self. Takes a lot of time.
Let's turn to you.
Oh.
What led you to become interested in trauma in the first place? And did you have any personal experience of it? Might also have
Yes,
been a
yes,
factor.
yes. So you look back on your life and sometimes things don't come clear until they do, as the camera turns its focus. I was in China in 1989 in Tiananmen Square, which was a violent act where students' hopes and dreams and sometimes their lives were quelled. I was working with students not in Beijing, in a place far south, but my students were also demonstrating and they lost siblings and friends. And I learned a lot about trauma. I didn't even realize it at the time, but I learned about how time gets scrambled. So 4 months felt like 2 years. I felt like I lived years in China. Another thing was living with this profound uncertainty, because at any time the whole place could have gone into civil war. Again, it was a witness of someone else's trauma, but it made its way into me. The third thing I learned was sitting alongside raw emotion. I mean, my students were, some of them, absolutely despairing, their hopes and dreams, and of course China's changed so massively since then. Their hopes and dreams really were crushed, and they were extraordinarily upset and distressed. And to sit alongside them was, to me, a privilege. And it felt to me as if that was an important thing to do. I was only a young woman, but it felt like that. And so I came back, trained as a counsellor. It was already a Samaritan, but I trained as a counsellor, psychotherapist, and the rest is history, as they say.
You said in your opening remarks that working with the whole body is important, not only the mind, involved with people who've experienced trauma. So can you just give an example or two of that, perhaps?
Yeah, so I said that trauma thinking has only incorporated the body in recent times. So there's some wonderful new therapies, one sensory motor psychotherapy, which I've trained in, somatic experiencing, which is something I've not trained in. But what they do is they start with the body. So if you think about my idea of the idea of the whoosh coming from the bottom of the spine, the body first. So these therapies, like I mentioned, start from the body. Now, I always was trained as a, psychodynamic, humanistic therapist, always thinking about the mind. I always thought there's something missing. I always quite thought there's something missing here. When I trained in sensory motor, it put a whole different perspective into my psychotherapy work. So an example is somebody who's, for example, being abducted, held down on one side. So you may go back to the memory. You might notice that the person's arm starts to slightly shake. You follow the body, you follow the body, you wait, you wait, you wait, you link it to the memory, you link it to the emotion, you let the body lead. You might find that the person wants to push like they couldn't when they were powerless. There's Pierre Janet, who's a psychotherapist in France, very early thinker, said we have to complete our movements as humans. Very often we don't. You can see animals do. They do. If you have a gazelle in the savannah, it's apprehended by a lion, it feigns dead. Oh gosh, the body has tried to save it from the lion. Last ditch attempt. Lion saunters off, wants to go after other gazelles. What does the gazelle do? It goes bat out of hell. Why? Because it's completing its range of movement. He calls it, Janet does, an arc. So if you have orange and you break an orange, the zest of the orange goes up into the air and falls down. So that person that I just gave the example of needed to push. Fantastic work, very exciting.
And something you also spoke about in your opening remarks was an issue that I think is called dissociation. Someone you're treating putting a gulf between themselves and a traumatic experience, putting it away in a compartment of the mind, hoping presumably that will help them forget it altogether, won't cause them any more trouble. What do you do in those circumstances?
Yeah, so I think that dissociation is very difficult. So I remember working with somebody who could hardly look at me. So they were turned away in the waiting room, their back to me, and they didn't even notice that they were doing that until I noticed it. So dissociation is a tricky one. If you're under gunfire, you don't even think about people in war zones. They don't even hear the gunfire. So that's necessary, isn't it, in a way to survive? But of course, there's a cost. There's a cost to them feeling alive. So what would you do with a dissociated person? You would notice. You respond with warmth and curiosity. Curiosity is a massive thing that we do all the time. Noticing the person, if there's any sign of facial tone difference or something that brings them to life. You hang out with them for a long time and gradually things will start to change. That's the short answer. I'm going to give you an example of a nice story, one of my favourite stories, and my sister's going to like this one particularly, I think. There she is at the back. So this is a trauma story about a young boy. There are different ways in, you see. We don't know what will bring somebody to life. It doesn't have to be psychotherapy, as the story shows. Until the age of 6, Jonah lives in a care home without hugs and emotional warmth. Unsurprisingly, he is numb and unresponsive in his adoptive family. The family are consistent and loving, but Jonah has been so hurt, he finds it hard to trust them. One day, the dad comes home with a rescue dog called Bounce. Bounce is shaky at first, approaching Jonah tentatively. Bounce has also been hurt. The frightened, numbed out boy instinctively senses and resonates with the tremulous acceptance in the dog, and the two are instantly inseparable. Through touch comes a soothing and reciprocity that brings the disconnected, battered and fearful Jonah to life. Bounce senses safety too, and from the first moments together never leaves his side. The duo that is formed is transformational. Jonah settles in his new family and he becomes much happier about going to school.
Let's just turn to something that really caught my attention again when you were speaking, as well as reading the book. This phenomenon you described as post-traumatic growth, a glorious thing you said, hope and goodness springing out of chaos. I mean, it's very positive talk out of something that can be very troublesome for people and very troublesome to deal with. Just give us an example, perhaps, of that. And in a way, would you say that people can actually come out strengthened by their collective traumatic experience and not only better able to cope with other traumas, but just as a strengthened people, individuals?
Yeah, I think
just define what you mean by this.
Yes, so I think that it can be, like I was hinting at earlier, like a distillation. There's somebody sitting here called Allah who bears some of the wounds of her people, her Palestinian people, and says that she's addicted to hope. She used that phrase the other day when we were meeting in Banbury. There can be, I think, a sense of great purpose that comes after trauma. It's almost like the periphery falls away. And there's a kind of, like the kintsugi vase with the gold around it. Those gold bits are the bits that really matter. It's like Nick and the things he does. He can't do as much as he did, but what he does, he really, really believes in. I think that having known suffering to the depths that somebody who's been traumatized has, allows them to really love life, perhaps, and live it and love it in a different way, have a different perspective on it. An example would be Terry Waite, who was absolutely a wonderful supporter of this project, and has humbled me massively in that. And when we first spoke on Zoom, he said that he felt he before he went to Lebanon, and he was held captive for 4.5 years and chained to that radiator every day, thinking that he was going to be killed maybe by the captor that came in. Most of the time he was in solitary confinement. But before that happened to him, he said he used to be somebody who was worried about his mortgage and paying the bills and the kind of peripheries of life that we all get bogged down in. And that, of course, he was changed through the trauma in the ways that we might imagine. But he was no longer worried about those things anymore. He came back and he thought, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start 3 charities. Well, he didn't say it quite like that, but he has started 3 charities. And at the age of 85, all he does in his life is go round starting New Emmaus Trust, or Hostage International, goes to meetings. He's relentless because he just knows what's important. So that's what I'd say happens. You kind of know what's most important if you're on the other side of trauma. Does that make sense?
If it's possible to assess this, would you say that trauma is actually on the rise? I mean, we tend to hear the words more and more. Is it just because people use the words more and more, maybe not always correctly? Is it more recognized? Is it properly recognized? And if it is on the rise, more of a problem for society, is help coming with the resources that it needs, particularly from the public purse?
Well, is it on the rise? So apparently the word crisis is used like 100% more than it ever was in the world. So perhaps that's something. I mean, historians say that although we live in troubled times, there have been troubled times before. However, sometimes I do think that the speed of which we all connect and also the capacity we really have to hurt each other does mean, I think, that there's a sense of ramping up, and we'd all recognise that. And although it isn't in the remit of my book to talk about the world, I'm talking about people and a smaller canvas, I can't help but reflect, of course, about polarisation and post-truth and narratives and locked-in claims. So I think we can see trauma responses everywhere. Is it being more recognised? I think that, of course, we hear the words trauma informed a lot now. So in education, in different charities, people are wanting to work in a trauma informed way. I think that's very important. Can
I just ask you though exactly what it means?
Well, I don't know fully. Maybe we could ask some people in the audience who perhaps know more. I'm sure it's the right direction of travel. I just hope that there's a deep understanding and not just going through things like that. There isn't a tsunami of people knocking at our doors, if that's part of what you're asking.
Yeah.
But there will always be lots of work for people in our profession, of course. I don't know if I answered you. I think that Nick would say as well, Nick Hitch, that it needs to be made more of a level playing field. He was very lucky because he had
Access to
money,
big resources,
he
yeah.
could be treated with the EMDR, he had all of these different treatments,
Yeah.
but his company paid for that.
Yeah.
If you're waiting on the NHS, you'll be waiting a long time maybe, and it's patchy around the country. So I think we need more of a level playing field. I think that's partly why I've written the book.
Very good point. I'm going to pause there to throw this open. We have half an hour or so, I'm glad to say still, for your questions, and I'm sure they could last a lot longer than half an hour. Who'd like to ask a question first? Well, okay, good.
I'll take advantage of the brief silence. Thank you, Philippa, very, very much for that. That was fascinating and very moving, and also full of hope. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about this distinction between trauma with a capital T and trauma with a little t, because I remember the first time I read your manuscript, I was very struck by that. We're very aware of people who are traumatized by these big cataclysmic events, you know, being abducted, being in a war, etc. But you also talk very eloquently in the book about the sort of insidious micro traumas that happen to us with a mother who's depressed, perhaps. And
Yeah,
that was very interesting to me. It wasn't quite what I would have called trauma in the way that we overuse the term, perhaps.
Well, if you think about, I'm glad you raised that, Kate. I think if you think about our needs not being met. So a good example would be a mother who's depressed, or if there's a family where the father is very ill or the mother's got mental illness. So the needs of the child for love, care, attention, the things that actually help them become them are not being met. That's trauma with a small t. But the child might not know that. Of course they might not. Like me not realizing China was trauma. You know, it's only what you know. That's the subtle thing. It may not be until very much later when you have difficulties with relationships or you have flashbacks that you realize, hey, something wasn't quite right there. So somebody with that kind of background might come into a loving relationship as an adult, and somebody who hangs around and listens to them, they might find themselves weeping uncontrollably. Why? Well, because nobody's ever done that before, but they didn't know that until that happened. So it's the missed relationship that comes right. Didn't know it was trauma.
Thank you.
Richard.
I read a book by Fergal Keane. This is in your line of business, like about his time as a war correspondent and the trauma he faced. One of the things he writes about is the way he feels that his post-traumatic stress drags him back into traumatic situations.
Yeah.
So it's almost like he becomes addicted to repeat the trauma, and he can't escape that. So you think, why am I putting myself back in the same situation that traumatized me before?
Yeah, it's not about logic. That's the thing. And I've read his book. And Raphael in my first chapter is rather like Fergal, not the same. But the thing that we get caught up in a hamster on a wheel. And Raphael, the person in my book, he had an abusive childhood whereby he didn't know any safety at all. He was powerless. And so what the war reporting did for him was to give him, in his own mind, strangely, we might say, but trauma has its own logic, a way out of trauma. It gave him a ticket out of trauma. Why? Well, because when he was doing his reporting close to gunfire, managing it, because he was dissociated, he felt powerful, where he felt so powerless before. And that was addictive. It made him feel alive, made him feel powerful. He was making a contribution. Can you see how complicated it is? So basically, it was very difficult because, of course, for Raphael, he was also becoming ill. His relationships were suffering. When he came out of the war zone, he was brooding. He could only be alive on the war, in the war zone. So he had eventually to be treated for PTSD, but it was a very difficult thing to get off that hamster wheel and to be able to tolerate, and this is another huge thing that happens in trauma, tolerate the good. We might think, oh, good, why can we not? We can tolerate good, we love good. If we're traumatized, we sometimes can't take the good in. Think of a hamster wheel, you're on a vortex, your whole body and mind is trying to survive, trying to conquer something. It's telling you this is what you have to do. Brain circuitry changes, as I said. So how can you get off that? It's a very long job. In his case, Raphael, it was his loving wife who took him to a spa hotel. Somebody's nodding like they might have read it. And she said, oh, you've been weird. You've been weird for a long time. And because of his trust in her, he tolerated it, hating the spa hotel, but going along with it. And gradually, and of course, then the employers came in too. So often with trauma, it's about a joined up care of the person. Have I answered your question, Richard?
Yeah.
Yes.
We're both in line.
Like I was very interested in your distinction between trauma with the capital and trauma with the small t. I was wondering, I was very interested in the question about, is it getting worse? Is there more of it?
Yeah.
I'm sometimes asked in my work, is there more child abuse now than there used to be? Because we hear about it so much more.
Yeah.
I don't think there is, although we'll never know. But there is a very particular kind of abuse, not just of children, but adults as well, that is quite particular to the 21st century. I wondered whether you had any comments in terms of a particular kind of trauma or a way in which trauma can be exacerbated by that wonderful thing, social media, and the way in which some people see their lives seem to be dominated by social media in the virtual world, and the capacity for people to hurt and insult and harass through social media. I'd be very interested in anything you might say about trauma in that respect. Well,
social media, absolutely, yes. And there's a story in the book, Jace, who comes absolutely in a vortex with social media, hurt by every encounter, and it changes her sense of self. I do think I think as I hinted earlier, have different fish to fry in the world, don't we, with social media, with the speed of things. So I don't know if it's getting worse, but I think we have particular challenges, like you say. Yeah.
Just in front, you also had a question.
Yeah, it's my question. Thank you for the talk. It's about re-traumatization.
Yeah.
And as I think it's come up, but a lot of people have talked about how this incessant wars, political upheaval, post-truth, pandemics, all of the 21st century, highly traumatic events that are collective trauma experiences. So I'm thinking your work as psychotherapists, you heal someone from trauma, they move into post-traumatic work, but aren't they then subject to be re-traumatized through collective trauma experiences that just keep accelerating in our world?
Yeah. So one of the chapters in my book is about your trauma, my trauma, how with systems, with families, with cultures, we're all connected. So I think that we do have to think much more broadly, and psychotherapists like me are thinking like this quite a lot. You know, are we just working one-to-one? Is that, like you hint in your question, is that enough if somebody's going into a re-traumatizing situation? There's somebody whose name escapes me right now, says that you can't work on trauma if you're still carrying the load. So there's so many people in our world today, dispossessed, displaced, that are already traumatized. So they can't work on their trauma. They're simply still surviving. So the work that we've done at St Martin in the Fields with refugees and asylum seekers, people without access to public funds, we did some work with them. Did they want to come to counselling? Well, we had a little room off the side. They didn't want to come to a room because that would have been re-traumatizing of being in an airport and of being questioned. But what we did was we trained the volunteers just to listen in the group, a group this size. And people would just hang around, linger with intent and have a little bubble of contact. Not official counselling, not trauma work, but just connection. That's much more appropriate, I think. A little bit goes a long way. A
You've
little
been
bit
able
goes a
to
long way.
apply that experience to any other situation now. I knew there was one thing that would work for them, but another one that put them off very much.
Sorry, Mike, can you say that again?
I just wondered the lessons you learned from that. Have you been able to apply that with any other group?
Well, I'm interested in homelessness. I'm working in Banbury. I think Simon's here. With homelessness and how systems how systems perpetuate trauma, and how the complex nature of homelessness is can be re-traumatizing if we don't think as a whole. People may have heard of Professor Ian McGilchrist, who is a psychiatrist who lives on the Isle of Skye, who wrote an amazing book called The Master and His Emissary. It's a tome, it's absolutely amazing. I know Jim likes that book, but basically his premise is that since the Enlightenment in the Western culture, we have a preference for the left brain rather than the right. The left brain develops the first year of life onwards. And it's all about systems, a mechanism, linear thinking, looking at the specific. Can you see echoes of that in Western culture? The right brain, which is the first year of life, which develops first, of course, is much more intuitive, seeing the whole picture and wanting to be fluid. But his premise is that we are far dominated by the left, and we don't integrate the two. Can't remember what the question was. But anyway, it's most interesting, of course.
Yeah, interesting
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah.
You had a question.
Yeah, I did. Thank you. And thank you for the talk. It's very interesting. And of course, the book. My question is, as I understand it, when you're talking about a trauma incident, so two people who experience the same trauma, so Nick's colleague, for instance, might not have experienced trauma or be traumatized by that traumatic event. Is there any common thread? I don't know how one would research this or find this out, but is there any common thread as to why people don't become traumatized? And is there an implied vulnerability beforehand? Or?
Oh, great question. I don't know your name. Sorry.
Chris.
Great question. I think it's often to do with what's happened before. So it's our inner resilience. And of course, that often goes back to developmental trauma.
Right.
So I think about it as dominoes all lined up in a row. You know, you touch one and they all go. So there will be more susceptibility, I think, to probably incident trauma if you've already known trauma before. But don't quote me on that. I don't know if we know enough.
Right, because the other people don't come forward. So.
Right. And it's really important to say that bad things happen to people. Yes, they weep and wail. They recover, it fades, they go on. No lasting trauma. But I think if your resilience is lower, and you also, if I sometimes think of it as like pockets in your genes. You've got a little pocket of trauma that's unresolved. This one will connect with that one. So yeah, it's like a pack of cards as well. So somebody might say, why don't you, when I do something to slight you, why don't you just think, well, I love, you trust in my love. Haven't you got anything in the bank? That's not a trauma-informed question, because if you're traumatized, in that moment, you've forgotten the love. You're eclipsed, like the Jack in a Box.
Yes.
I guess it really.
And there's somebody behind you as well, but you go ahead, go ahead, with plenty of time, well, we've got 10 minutes left, so.
You're mentioning the right side of the brain. the
Yes.
intuitive Brain. What do you think about energy healing, which is becoming kind of proliferated in our time?
I don't know enough about it to really comment. I think where everything is connected and very open to energy healing. Is energy healing, did you say?
Yes, like Mexico, and it's coming from indigenous cultures.
Well,
It's very
I think we've got a
shamanic.
lot to learn from indigenous cultures in all kinds of ways, and particularly with trauma. So, you know, in an indigenous culture, you'd have rituals around grief and overwhelm. Carolyn Spring, who some of you might know, she's a trauma specialist. She talks about how in ancient primitive times, say, you know, on your compound, wolves attacked you, and you had to fight them off, and then you had to build fences, and then the next thing you did would be that you'd sit around in a group and talk about it, and you'd weep and wail, and you'd just say whatever you did, and then after you'd done that, guess what you do next? You go out and you go and pick the berries. You move on, but you've done the job. Don't you think that's wonderful? And don't you think we get so clogged up so often by not kind of following what the body and the mind needs to do, when it needs to do it?
Yes,
So you were just saying earlier, thank you very much. You were just saying earlier that to go back into trauma is to re-traumatize. How do you specifically work with trauma if you don't talk about it like you just described?
You mean if we don't talk about the story?
How you work and you're not, you know, you're obviously not wanting to re-traumatize. So
Oh,
how do
okay.
you do it as an expert yourself?
Well, you would be working with the person. If you think about that volcano, you're working with the representation of them as that volcano. So you'd be working with your circles going around, and you'd be observing all the time on all those levels. And sometimes, and this how often happens in psychotherapy, is a bit of trauma pops up. So even though the person may not be saying, oh, I have a trauma, they may come with other problems, but they come with the whole of them, with those concentric circles. But then something pops up. Aha, you've got and either a memory will come back, or it will be something in the body, no memory. Sometimes it can be about kind of piecing a jigsaw together as well. So you're kind of imagining.
Go in with you, but will that be traumatizing?
Well, that's the bit. So I was going to talk about dissipation. Can I get my visual aid? I haven't used enough of my visual aid. So if we think about it this way, here is a traumatized person. The trauma is the ball. The ball is practically filling that jar. There's not a lot else going on. What they might want to do is to find their resources, either pre-existing resources. So the resilience in physics, I think, means a substance that's or a solution that stays the same after something happens. So resilience is maybe previous resources or new resources, taking in the good. But also, as you do that, this is the clever bit, maybe dissipating a bit of the charge. Now that could be done directly through memory, investigative work with a psychotherapist, or it could be done indirectly through running, through cold water swimming, which I know some people use therapeutically. If you think about it, that could be a secondary discharge, but very healing. Again, other cultures could do that. Indigenous cultures could do some dissipation that way, letting that fizz be released at the same time as allowing the good things in to help with the discharge. So an example of that would be somebody who feels very, very small and frightened inside. This is a real story. what they used to do is look out to the night sky. And somehow or other it was made better. Can you imagine that? It's like the dissipation of the charge inside of them was released in the night sky. I think somebody who was speaking last week at St Martin in the Fields said something like that. If you keep your head to the sky, can't remember who it was, whatever's going on inside, you change your posture. That's another thing you can do. So it's when you lengthen your spine, you don't just lengthen it like that, you lengthen it from the bottom. It completely changes your posture and the way of looking at the world. I know it sounds a superficial thing, but changing posture is amazing for dissipation. And then you get here. So you still got the trauma. You still got it there. It could be returned to, it could be triggered at a later event. Maybe. But you've got so much other good stuff going on. You're going to be in pretty good shape. Wouldn't we all like to be that one?
Right, we've time for another couple of questions if there are. Yes.
Jim.
Haven't had none from that side.
In a conversation with Mike, the idea of trauma-informed practice came up.
Yes, I didn't answer that one.
Could you say a little bit more about your practice in that project in St Martin in the Fields? Because that seemed to me a wonderful example of the subtlety of trauma-informed, good trauma-informed practice, when you were talking about the need they found not to be taken into a little space that would remind them of something that was re-traumatizing, but speaking in a very ordinary way in the full mass of people in the place. Could you say a little bit more about that project? Because it sounds as if it's a really good example of trauma-informed practice.
Yes, so an example would be that we would be actually training the volunteers. So, for example, if they might meet somebody who was rather charged and had some red mist, and that they, as a volunteer, didn't know what to do about it. There's actually a story in the book, kind of slightly elaborated from this. This volunteer would be trained, if you like, to think about that arc. So if somebody's shouting, you know, why don't you give me that, not this? Rather, you might be trained to really notice the effect of that on yourself, on your own nervous system, because one trauma catches into another one. And so you'd be having what we call a dual consciousness. So you're self-soothing at the same time as noticing that you're frightened inside, and allowing the person who activated. Of course, when we see somebody in a red mist, we only see the red mist, don't we? We get terrified by it. But what's going on down the lift shaft is that they're frightened. So that's part of the training as well, to see the frightened person beneath the trauma symptom. If there's one thing about trauma symptom that I'm passionate about, it's looking down the lift shaft. It's looking beyond the behavior to the trauma story. And I think that there's quite a lot that we could learn in our societies, couldn't we, by not turning a blind eye to bad things. Of course, we need to set boundaries and say when something's not right. I don't mean that. But we are also quick to judge. And if we don't understand trauma, we can re-traumatize. And that perpetuates it.
Does anybody have another question? Okay, I've got one last one. Probably the last one. What or who supports you in your work with trauma in the practice?
In the world?
In your work with trauma, what supports you?
Well, I do quite a lot about discharging my own, what I pick up sitting with somebody who's very disturbed. I would also be picking that up myself. So I've learned my ways and means. My staple diets are yoga and running and creative music, anything that is allowing that discharge that I may have taken in myself. to be released.
Mm.
I'm not saying that I'm perfect at it. And one of the things about writing a book about trauma is that you have a ringside view on all of these trauma responses for 4 years. And so any pockets of trauma that I might have might well be activated. The one that I found personally hardest is the sense of urgency. So first chapter of the book, trauma takes you over. I'm a living example of it. Because there's that sense of, and it's hard to separate it out like the tangled string. What's the creative process and what's the trauma charge? I don't fully know the answer, but I know that those who live with me and are closest to me will know that I'm sometimes a bit out of balance, and the book has done more than perhaps it should have done in that direction. And that's been a concern because I want to be a good ethical practitioner. That's my vocation. I don't want a book to take me off off track. But this has been a joy to talk to you. Not taking me off track at all. Thank you for being so.
Yes, and on that note, thank you very much.